Have you ever walked through an ancient forest and felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon you? Perhaps you've stood before a crumbling castle wall and sensed the echoes of voices long silenced by time. Or maybe you've wandered into an old country church and noticed a strange face peering down from the stonework, wreathed in leaves, watching you with eyes carved from shadow and memory. These moments, these shivers of recognition, connect us to something profound. They remind us that England's landscape is not merely earth and stone, but a living archive of stories, a place where legend and history intertwine so completely that one cannot always distinguish where fact ends and folklore begins. In the tales that follow, we will explore some of England's most enduring legends. We will meet kings and outlaws, monsters and heroes, spirits of nature and harbingers of doom. These stories have survived for centuries, passed down through countless tellings, because they contain truths that transcend their fantastic elements. They speak of justice and injustice, of the relationship between humans and the natural world, of the consequences of our actions, of the hope that even in the darkest times, heroes can arise and wrongs can be righted. So settle in, and let us begin our journey through the mist-shrouded forests, across the ancient battlefields, into the shadowy churchyards, and along the lonely roads where England's folklore was born, and where, in some sense, it lives still. If you listen closely, you might hear the distant echo of a name that has resonated through the centuries with a power few other legends possess: Arthur, King Arthur, the once and future king. Even today, more than 1,500 years after he supposedly lived, if indeed he lived at all, his name conjures images of noble knights, enchanted swords, courtly love, and tragic betrayal. But who was Arthur, really? And how did a figure who may have been nothing more than a minor British warlord become the central hero of one of the world's greatest legend cycles? If Arthur existed at all, he would have lived in the late 5th or early 6th century, during those chaotic years following the withdrawal of Roman administration from Britain around 410. The Roman Empire, which had brought 4 centuries of relative stability to the island, was collapsing. Without Roman legions to defend the frontiers, Britain became vulnerable. Saxon invaders from across the North Sea began settling along the eastern coasts, pushing westward. The native Britons, descendants of the Celtic peoples who had lived there long before Rome arrived, fought back. Based on what little evidence survives, somewhere in this confused period, a leader may have arisen, a man skilled in warfare, who achieved significant victories against the Saxon advance. The earliest references appear in sources written long after the supposed events. The Historia Brittonum, attributed to a 9th century Welsh monk named Nennius, lists 12 battles fought by someone named Arthur, including a victory at Mount Badon where Arthur is claimed to have personally killed 960 men. The Annales Cambriae, Welsh annals compiled in the mid-10th century, mentions Arthur at the Battle of Badon and his death at Camlan. These sparse references suggest that stories about a warrior named Arthur were circulating in Wales centuries after he supposedly lived. However, scholars increasingly question the historical reliability of these sources, and the claimed details, like Arthur killing nearly 1,000 men single-handedly, clearly belong to legend rather than history. What transformed this possible historical figure into legend was Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1138. Geoffrey, who may have drawn on earlier Welsh traditions now lost to us, created an elaborate narrative of Arthur's life. He gave us Merlin the wizard, the sword Excalibur, the conception at Tintagel through magic and deception, the gathering of knights, the conquests across Europe, and the final betrayal by Mordred. Geoffrey's work was immensely popular and hugely influential, despite contemporary critics who questioned its historical accuracy. From this foundation, later writers would build the entire edifice of Arthurian romance. The legend, as it developed through the Middle Ages, tells of a Briton in desperate need of a hero. The land was fractured, petty warlords fighting amongst themselves while external enemies threatened. Into this chaos came a test, arranged by the wizard Merlin. In London, before a great cathedral, appeared a stone, and thrust deep into that stone was a magnificent sword. Upon the stone were inscribed words that proclaimed whoever could draw forth this sword would be rightful king of all Britain. Knights came from throughout the land, lords and princes, men of strength and reputation. They grasped the sword's hilt, strained with all their might, but the weapon remained immovably lodged in the stone. The sword rejected them all. Arthur, in the most common version of the tale, was not even aware of his royal heritage. He had been spirited away as an infant by Merlin and raised by Sir Ector, a minor nobleman, growing up alongside Ector's son Kay. When a great tournament was held in London, Arthur attended as Kay's squire. In the rush and confusion of preparation, Kay discovered he had forgotten his sword. He sent Arthur to fetch it, but Arthur, unable to return home in time, spotted the sword in the stone, thinking it merely a sword left unattended. The young man grasped its hilt and drew it forth as effortlessly as pulling a knife from butter. The steel sang as it left the stone, gleaming with an inner light that seemed to proclaim its significance to all who beheld it. The nobles and knights were astonished. How could this unknown youth, this mere squire, succeed where the greatest warriors had failed? Some challenged his right, demanded he replace the sword and draw it again. Arthur did so, not once but multiple times, and always the sword came forth in his hand alone. Finally, Merlin stepped forward and revealed the truth. This was no squire but Arthur Pendragon, son of Uther, the rightful heir to Britain's throne. The sword had chosen him. Destiny itself had marked him as king. And so Arthur's reign began. With Merlin's wisdom to guide him, he brought order to the chaos. He defeated the Saxon invaders and pushed them back. He united the fractious British kingdoms under his rule. He established his court at Camelot, a place that has never been definitively located on any map, but which represents in legend an ideal of justice, honor, and nobility. At Camelot's heart stood the Round Table, a brilliant stroke of symbolic equality. Unlike rectangular tables with their clear hierarchy, positions of power at the head and positions of subservience below, the Round Table had no head. All who sat at it were equal in honor. The greatest knights of Christendom gathered there, not as Arthur's subjects, but as his brothers in arms. These knights, the Knights of the Round Table, became legends in their own right. Sir Lancelot, the greatest warrior, whose skill with sword and lance was unmatched. Sir Galahad, pure of heart, the knight destined to find the Holy Grail. Sir Gawain, courteous and brave, Arthur's own nephew. Sir Percival, who also quested for the Grail. Sir Bedivere, loyal to the very end. Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother. Sir Tristan, whose doomed love for Isolde paralleled the tragedy that would ultimately destroy Camelot. These men rode forth from the shining towers to right wrongs, to protect the weak, to uphold the ideals of chivalry that Arthur embodied. For a time, it seemed as though Arthur had created something that might endure forever. He married Guinevere, a woman of great beauty, and Camelot glittered with tournaments and feasts. The land prospered under Arthur's just rule, but even in this golden age, shadows gathered. The seeds of Camelot's destruction were present from the beginning, waiting only for time and human weakness to bring them to terrible fruition. The first shadow was Lancelot's love for Queen Guinevere. What began perhaps as courtly admiration, the chivalric devotion of a knight to his lady, deepened into something more forbidden. Lancelot and Guinevere fell in love, and though the stories disagree on whether this love was ever consummated, its existence was poison to the fellowship of the Round Table. When other knights discovered or suspected the truth, accusations flew. Lancelot, to prove Guinevere's innocence, or perhaps to rescue her from execution, fought against his former brothers. The Round Table fractured. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. The second shadow was Mordred. In some versions, he is Arthur's nephew, son of Arthur's sister. In others, particularly later versions, he is Arthur's own son, conceived through an unwitting incestuous union with his half-sister Morgausa. However he came to be, Mordred grew up twisted by bitterness and ambition. He resented Arthur, envied his position, coveted his throne. While Arthur and many of his knights pursued the quest for the Holy Grail, that sacred cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, Mordred worked his mischief at home, spreading dissent, gathering supporters. The quest for the Grail itself revealed the flaws of Camelot's knights. Only the purest, Galahad, could achieve the Grail. Others, tainted by worldly concerns, by pride or lust or violence, failed. The quest scattered the fellowship, sent good men to their deaths in pursuit of an unattainable ideal, and when it ended, the Round Table was diminished. The survivors returned to find their company reduced, their brotherhood weakened, their purpose uncertain. Mordred seized his moment. While Arthur was away, dealing with challenges to his rule abroad, Mordred claimed the throne for himself. He spread lies that Arthur was dead, convinced many to support his claim. Some tales even say he tried to force Guinevere to marry him, to legitimize his usurpation. Arthur, when he learned of the betrayal, rushed home with whatever forces remained loyal to him. The final confrontation was inevitable. The Battle of Camlan, fought on some unidentified field in Britain, became the graveyard of Camelot's dream. Brother fought brother, friend slew friend. The ideals of the Round Table drowned in a tide of blood. Arthur and Mordred met in personal combat. The accounts vary, but the essence remains. Arthur struck Mordred down with a mortal wound, but not before Mordred delivered a terrible blow in return. The traitor fell dead, but Arthur, the king, the hero, lay dying. The last of Arthur's loyal knights carried him from that field of sorrow to the shores of a mist-shrouded lake. As they stood there, uncertain, a barge appeared, draped in black, steered by mysterious figures, sometimes said to be 3 queens or enchantresses. They lifted Arthur gently, tenderly, and laid him in the vessel. "Where are you taking him?" the knights cried. "To Avalon," came the answer, spoken in whispers. "To the mystical isle, the place beyond the reach of mortal men, where Arthur's wounds might be healed." The barge glided away into the mist, carrying the dying king, and vanished from mortal sight. And here, the legend takes on its most powerful dimension. For Arthur did not die, not truly. He sleeps in Avalon, waiting. When Britain faces its darkest hour, when the need is greatest, Arthur will return. He is the once and future king, the eternal hope of the British people that justice and nobility and honor are not dead, but merely sleeping, ready to rise again when called. His tomb, wherever it truly lies, supposedly bears an inscription: "Here lies Arthur, king that was and king that will be." The legend of Arthur has never died. Through the centuries, through countless retellings and reinventions, it has endured. In the medieval period, it embodied chivalric ideals. In the Victorian era, it represented a lost golden age. In modern times, it has been adapted to speak to contemporary concerns. Arthur has been portrayed as a historical figure, a fantasy hero, a symbolic representation of ideal leadership. Glastonbury claims to be Avalon. Tintagel claims to be his birthplace. Various locations claim to be Camelot. The truth of whether Arthur existed matters less than the truth of what he represents. The hope for justice, the fellowship of equals, the tragic awareness that even the greatest achievements are fragile and that human weakness can destroy them. And so the story of Arthur endures, one of the foundational legends of English and indeed Western culture. If King Arthur represents the ideal of noble kingship, then Robin Hood represents something equally powerful but very different: the champion of the common people, the outlaw who defies corrupt authority, the man who lives outside the law but embodies a higher justice. For centuries, the legend of Robin Hood has captured imaginations, inspiring countless retellings, and in every age, each generation has found in this tale something that speaks to their own concerns and aspirations. Unlike Arthur, whose legend is rooted in the mists of the post-Roman period, Robin Hood's story is set in a more specific time, usually during the reign of King John or Richard the Lionheart in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Yet paradoxically, Robin's historical existence is even more questionable than Arthur's. No contemporary documents clearly identify a historical Robin Hood. The earliest references appear in ballads and tales from the 15th century, and these speak of events supposedly occurring 2 or 3 centuries earlier. Many scholars believe Robin Hood is entirely fictional, a composite figure drawing on various outlaw traditions. Others argue that multiple real outlaws may have contributed elements to the legend. What matters more than historical truth is what Robin Hood represented to the people who kept his legend alive. Medieval England was a rigidly hierarchical society. The Norman conquest of 1066 had created a French-speaking aristocracy ruling over an English-speaking peasantry. The forests, once commons where ordinary people could hunt and gather, had been declared royal hunting preserves. To kill a deer could mean death or mutilation. Sheriffs and nobles extracted taxes and fees from struggling farmers. Justice was arbitrary, corrupted by power and wealth. In this context, the idea of a hero who thumbed his nose at authority, who took from the rich and gave to the poor, who made fools of sheriffs and bishops, was deeply appealing. The legend, as it developed, tells of a man driven to outlawry by injustice. In some versions, Robin is a nobleman, perhaps the Earl of Huntingdon, wrongfully stripped of his lands and title. In others, he is a yeoman, a free farmer, pushed beyond endurance by oppressive laws and corrupt officials. Whatever his origin, Robin finds himself forced to flee into Sherwood Forest, that vast wilderness of ancient oaks that still exists in Nottinghamshire, though much reduced from its medieval extent. In the forest, Robin is joined by others, men who have also fled the harsh justice of Norman law. First among them is Little John, and the tale of their meeting has become iconic. Robin, traveling alone through the forest, came to a narrow log bridge over a stream. From the opposite direction came another man, enormous in stature. Neither would yield the right of way. Words were exchanged. Pride was at stake. Robin challenged the stranger to a staff-fighting contest on the bridge itself. They fought with quarterstaffs, those long wooden poles, each trying to knock the other into the water below. Despite Robin's skill, the giant finally landed a mighty blow that sent Robin tumbling into the stream. Rather than being angry, Robin laughed at his own dunking and invited the stranger to join his band. The big man agreed, and ever after was known as Little John, the nickname a piece of medieval humor, calling the largest man in the band by the smallest name. Others joined. Friar Tuck, round of belly and red of face, a man of the church who was nonetheless as ready with his fists and quarterstaff as with prayers. Will Scarlet, quick-tempered and loyal. Much the miller's son, Allan a Dale, the minstrel whose songs spread tales of Robin's deeds throughout England. Together, they became the Merry Men, living free in the greenwood, poaching the king's deer, sleeping under the stars, bound together by loyalty and their shared status as outlaws. Their life was one of constant adventure and constant danger. They ambushed wealthy travelers on the forest roads, but not all travelers. Robin had a code. The poor and honest were left unharmed, sometimes even gifted with coin, but corrupt churchmen, greedy merchants, and above all, the officials of the Sheriff of Nottingham, these were fair game. Gold and goods seized from the oppressors were distributed among the common people who suffered under unjust laws. The rich were humiliated and robbed. The poor were helped and defended. Justice, denied by the corrupt system, was administered in the greenwood according to Robin's own code. The Sheriff of Nottingham became Robin's great nemesis. Time and again, the sheriff laid traps for the outlaw. He offered rewards for Robin's capture. He sent men at arms crashing through the forest. He devised schemes to lure Robin into the open, and time and again, Robin outwitted him. Sometimes Robin would enter Nottingham in disguise, his face hidden by a hood, perhaps even winning the prize at archery contests under the sheriff's own nose before vanishing back into the forest. The sheriff's impotent rage became a source of amusement, not just to Robin's band, but to the common people who loved the outlaw and hated his pursuers. Robin's skill with the longbow became legendary. Stories told that he could split an arrow already stuck in a target at 100 paces, that he never missed his mark, that when he drew his great yew bow, death itself flew from the string. In an age when the longbow was England's most feared weapon, when English archers would later decimate French armies at Crécy and Agincourt, Robin Hood represented the ideal archer, the master of the weapon that gave common Englishmen the power to strike down armored knights. And then there was Maid Marian. Her role in the legend is somewhat ambiguous, appearing more prominently in later versions than early ballads. She is portrayed variously as a noblewoman who gave up her comfortable life to join Robin in the forest, or as a fierce warrior in her own right, as skilled with bow and blade as any of the merry men. In later, more romantic versions, she becomes Robin's true love, the woman whose devotion matches his courage, who stands by him through all dangers. Her presence adds another dimension to the legend, the idea that love and partnership can flourish even in the harsh conditions of outlaw life. The political context of the legend is significant. Robin Hood stories are often set during King Richard's absence at the Crusades, with England left in the grasping hands of his brother Prince John and corrupt officials like the Sheriff of Nottingham. Robin becomes a loyal subject of good King Richard while opposing the bad government that rules in Richard's absence. This allows the legend to criticize authority and champion rebellion while remaining technically loyal to the legitimate monarch. When Richard returns and justice is restored, Robin is sometimes pardoned and rewarded for his loyalty. But the early ballads were rawer, less romanticized. The medieval Robin Hood was not necessarily a noble redistributor of wealth. He was a violent outlaw who killed without remorse, who celebrated his brutal revenge against those who wronged him. It was only in later retellings, particularly from the 19th century onward, that Robin became fully gentlemanly, a wronged nobleman fighting for justice with clean hands. Each age remade Robin Hood in its own image, projecting onto this flexible legend its own values and concerns. What has made Robin Hood's legend so enduring? Perhaps it is the universal appeal of the underdog who triumphs over powerful oppressors. Perhaps it is the romance of living free in nature, unbound by society's rules. Perhaps it is the fantasy of perfect justice administered outside corrupt systems. Or perhaps it is simply that the story is wonderfully entertaining, full of clever schemes, daring escapes, impossible shots, and wit that humiliates the pompous and powerful. The legend has never been confined to England. Robin Hood stories spread throughout Europe and crossed the Atlantic to America. Countless books, films, and television series have retold the tale, each adding new elements while keeping the core recognizable. Robin has been portrayed as a Saxon resisting Norman oppression, as a proto-socialist, as a libertarian hero, as a romantic figure, as a grim and gritty outlaw. The forest has been variously depicted as a green paradise, a harsh wilderness, or a symbolic space of freedom opposed to the constraints of civilization. Sherwood Forest itself remains, though vastly reduced from its medieval extent. Visitors can still walk among ancient oaks, some of which may have stood there when the legend was first told. The major oak, a massive ancient tree, is popularly identified as Robin Hood's hideout, though the tree itself may not be quite as old as the legend. Nottingham celebrates its most famous fictional resident. And throughout England and beyond, pubs bear the name Robin Hood, keeping alive the memory of the outlaw who never let injustice stand, who never bent the knee to corrupt power, and who lived and died free in the greenwood. The legend endures because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the desire for justice, the belief that the powerful should not be allowed to oppress the weak with impunity, the hope that heroes, even unlikely ones, can arise to challenge tyranny. Robin Hood, championing the common people, remains one of England's most beloved legends. Not all English legends speak of human heroes and noble quests. Some tap into far older, darker fears, primal terrors that lurk in the shadows when night falls and civilization's thin veneer falls away. Among these darker legends, few are as persistently terrifying as Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, a creature that has haunted the coastline and countryside of England's eastern counties for centuries. The name itself carries weight. Shuck, the etymology is debated, but most scholars believe it derives from the Old English word skuka, meaning demon or devil. Some suggest it might come from the local dialect word shucky, meaning shaggy or hairy. Either way, the name has become synonymous with fear in East Anglia, that flat, wind-swept region of Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, and Essex, where the North Sea crashes against lonely beaches and mist rolls in from the fens. Black Shuck is described as a massive dog, far larger than any natural canine. Some witnesses have reported the creature being the size of a calf. Others claim it matches a horse in size. Its fur is invariably described as black, shaggy, matted, but the most terrifying feature, mentioned in nearly every account, are its eyes. Glowing eyes that burn like coals, usually described as red but sometimes as green or yellow. In some versions, Shuck has but a single eye, positioned in the center of its forehead like a cyclops, blazing with malevolent fire. The creature is said to move in absolute silence. Despite its enormous size, Black Shuck makes no sound as it pads along dark lanes or across lonely fields. Some accounts mention the rattle of chains, invisible shackles that the beast drags behind it. Witnesses report an overwhelming sense of dread upon encountering the creature, a primal terror that goes beyond simple fear of a large dog. Shuck's appearance is often accompanied by a charnel smell, a scent of decay and wrongness that lingers in the air after the creature has passed. Black Shuck haunts specific types of locations, lonely country roads and pathways, particularly those near churches or graveyards, coastal areas where sea cliffs drop to crashing waves. The isolated stretches of the fens, those flat, marshy expanses that can seem otherworldly when fog descends. Crossroads, those traditional sites of supernatural activity and folklore throughout Europe. The creature appears most often at night, particularly during storms, though some daylight sightings have been reported. The origins of the Black Shuck legend are uncertain, but likely ancient. The Vikings, who settled heavily in East Anglia during the 9th and 10th centuries, may have brought with them tales of the hounds of Odin, Geri, and Freki, who accompanied the Norse All-Father. In Viking belief, these great wolves or hounds protected Norse settlers against the Saxons. As Christianity spread and pagan beliefs were condemned, what had been protective spirits in one culture's mythology became demonic forces in another's. The Christian Saxons, regarding Norse paganism as devil worship, would naturally reinterpret Odin's hounds as servants of Satan. Similar phantom black dogs appear throughout British folklore under various names: Barghest, Padfoot, Gytrash, Hairy Jack. The motif is widespread, suggesting either a common origin in very ancient belief or perhaps a universal human tendency to project fears onto the image of a predator, the wolf or wild dog, transformed into something supernatural. But Black Shuck, with its specific geographic association with East Anglia, has become perhaps the most famous of these spectral hounds. For most witnesses, Black Shuck is an omen of death. To see the creature is to be warned that you or someone close to you will die within the year. Some stories claim that merely making eye contact with Shuck will kill you on the spot. Other accounts are less uniformly malevolent, presenting Shuck as sometimes protective, guiding lost travelers to safety or warning them away from danger. But the overwhelming tenor of the legend emphasizes terror and doom. The most famous Black Shuck incidents, the ones that cemented the creature's reputation, occurred on a single day, the 4th of August, 1577. A violent thunderstorm raged across Suffolk, thunder crashing and lightning splitting the sky. In the town of Bungay, terrified worshippers had gathered for service in St. Mary's Church, seeking refuge and perhaps divine protection from the tempest. Suddenly, according to accounts, the church doors burst open. Framed in the entrance, illuminated by lightning, stood an enormous black hound with eyes like burning coals. The creature charged down the nave, past the frozen congregation. It seized a man and a boy in its jaws, killing them both instantly. Others were thrown aside by the creature's passage. As quickly as it had appeared, the black hound was gone, vanishing into the storm, leaving behind only terror and corpses. The same day, miles away at Blytheburgh's Holy Trinity Church, the horror repeated. Again, the black dog burst into a church service, killed 2 men at prayer, and vanished. As it departed through the north door at Blytheburgh, according to legend, it left scorch marks on the ancient wood, marks that can still be seen today, blackened impressions in the door that locals call the devil's fingerprints. A contemporary account exists, written by Abraham Fleming shortly after the events. His pamphlet, A Strange and Terrible Wonder, describes the incidents in dramatic terms, speaking of a strange and terrible tempest and a great and strange wonder. Fleming, like most people of his time, interpreted the events through a religious lens. This was divine punishment, God's wrath manifest, or perhaps Satan himself come to strike at the faithful. Modern analysis offers a more prosaic explanation. The violent storm was real and well documented in contemporary records. Lightning did strike both churches that day, causing significant damage to the buildings and casualties among those inside. Historical records confirm damage to Bungay Church's tower and the deaths of 2 men in the belfry. In the terror and chaos of a severe storm, with lightning striking the church, thunder shaking the building, and people being injured or killed by falling debris or electrical discharge, traumatized survivors may have genuinely believed they saw the demon dog that was already famous in local folklore. Alternatively, later memories may have incorporated the familiar Black Shuck legend into their recollection of a genuinely traumatic natural disaster. It's worth noting that Fleming, writing from London and not present at the events, likely based his dramatic account on stories he heard, embellished for both entertainment and moral instruction. The scorch marks on Blytheburgh's door, while real and still visible, may have different origins than the legend claims, possibly dating to a later period. But rationalization cannot fully explain away Black Shuck. Sightings continued long after 1577. Through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, people reported encounters with a massive black dog on lonely East Anglian roads. Even in the 20th century, accounts persisted. In 1938, a man walking his own dog along a coastal path near Overstrand reported encountering an enormous black hound that appeared suddenly from nowhere, terrified his dog, and then vanished as mysteriously as it had come. During World War II, airmen stationed at bases in Norfolk and Suffolk occasionally reported seeing a large black dog on the perimeter of airfields at night. In 1972, A group of people on the coast road near Sheringham claimed to see a huge dog-like creature that ran in front of their vehicle before disappearing. The persistence of these sightings raises interesting questions. Are they simply the continuation of folklore? People primed by knowledge of the legend to interpret ambiguous nighttime experiences as encounters with Black Shuck? Are they misidentifications of large ordinary dogs seen under poor lighting conditions? Fear and expectation magnifying memory into something more supernatural? Or might there be something genuinely unusual occurring, whether psychological, paranormal, or some natural phenomenon we don't fully understand? The academic study of folklore offers various frameworks for understanding Black Shuck. From a psychological perspective, the demon dog might represent externalized anxiety and fear, particularly fears associated with death and the unknown. Dogs in general occupy an ambiguous position in human psychology. They are simultaneously our companions and potential threats, domesticated yet retaining something wild. A monstrous dog, then, becomes a perfect symbol for things that are familiar yet dangerous, known yet unknowable. From a sociological perspective, shared belief in creatures like Black Shuck served important functions in rural communities. Such legends enforced social control, keeping people from wandering dangerous areas at night. They provided explanations for misfortunes and deaths, particularly sudden or unexplained ones. And they created shared cultural identity, stories that bound communities together and distinguished one region from another. The geographic specificity of Black Shuck is notable. While phantom black dog legends exist throughout Britain, Black Shuck belongs specifically to East Anglia. The creature is embedded in the landscape and culture of Norfolk, Suffolk, and the surrounding counties. This regional identity strengthens the legend. East Anglians can claim Black Shuck as their own particular terror, a piece of folklore that distinguishes their region and connects them to their ancestors who told the same stories centuries ago. In recent decades, Black Shuck has experienced something of a revival. Books have been written collecting historical accounts and modern sightings. Local tourism has embraced the legend, with ghost tours and visitor attractions incorporating Black Shuck into the regional folklore offerings. The creature has appeared in fiction, from children's books to horror novels. And in 2014, an archaeological excavation near Leiston Abbey in Suffolk uncovered the skeleton of a massive dog, far larger than normal, dating from around 700 years ago. While certainly not proof of Black Shuck's existence, the discovery reignited public interest and speculation. What should we make of Black Shuck today? For those of a skeptical bent, the creature is simply folklore, explainable through a combination of misidentification, cultural transmission, psychological factors, and the human tendency to find patterns and create narratives. For believers in the paranormal, Black Shuck might be a genuine supernatural entity, a spirit or demon that has haunted East Anglia for centuries. And for many, particularly those living in the regions where the legend is strongest, Black Shuck occupies an ambiguous middle ground, probably not real but not something to be entirely dismissed either, especially when walking alone down a dark country lane on a stormy night. The legend endures because it taps into primal fears. The fear of predators that hunted our ancestors in the darkness. The fear of the supernatural, of things that operate outside natural law. And perhaps most powerfully, the fear of isolation, of being alone in wild places where civilization's rules don't apply and ancient powers still hold sway. Black Shuck, padding silently through the mist with eyes of fire, remains one of England's most chilling legends, a reminder that some parts of the country still feel haunted, still carry echoes of older, darker times when demons might indeed walk the earth in canine form. Walk into almost any old church in England, particularly those built during the medieval period, and begin to look carefully at the stone carvings. Examine the capitals atop pillars, the bosses in the vaulted ceilings, the misericords beneath choir seats, the decorative elements around doorways and windows. Sooner or later, you will find him. A face emerging from foliage. A human head from whose mouth spew leaves and vines. Eyes peering out from a thicket of carved vegetation. This is the Green Man, one of England's most widespread and mysterious artistic motifs. The term Green Man itself is surprisingly modern, coined only in 1939 by Lady Raglan in an article for the Folklore Journal. Before that, these carvings went by various names: foliate heads, leaf masks, or simply decorative elements without particular significance. But Lady Raglan's term captured the imagination, and within a few decades, the Green Man had become a well-known concept, a recognizable archetype discussed by scholars, embraced by artists, and adopted as a symbol by various contemporary movements, from environmentalism to neo-paganism. The carvings themselves fall into several categories. In some, the face is made entirely from leaves, with oak or hawthorn or ivy forming every feature, as though a human visage has been constructed from the forest itself. In others, vegetation emerges from the figure's mouth, sometimes a simple spray of leaves, other times elaborate vines that curl around the face and fill the available space. In the most dramatic examples, foliage erupts from every facial orifice, from mouth and nose and ears and even eyes, as though the life force of nature itself is bursting forth from within the human form. The expressions vary. Some green men appear peaceful, almost serene. Others look grotesque, even threatening, mouths stretched wide to accommodate the vegetation pouring forth. Some seem to be in agony. Others appear to be laughing. These carvings are not rare curiosities. They appear by the hundreds, possibly thousands, throughout Britain and continental Europe. They are found in great cathedrals and tiny parish churches, in monastic buildings and manor houses, spanning from the Romanesque period through the Gothic era and beyond. Their ubiquity raises immediate questions. What do they mean? Why were they placed in Christian buildings? And where did this motif originate? The most immediate interpretation is that the Green Man represents nature, vegetation, the cycle of growth and renewal. The face emerging from or sprouting leaves suggests the human connection to the natural world. The foliage pouring from the mouth might symbolize speech, the utterance of natural law, or perhaps the divine word bringing forth creation. The recurring image suggests life force, the irrepressible power of vegetation that returns each spring, the sap rising in the tree, the seed sprouting, the vine creeping over stone. In this reading, the Green Man is a celebration of life's persistence and nature's power. But why, then, is this seemingly pagan symbol found so predominantly in Christian churches? This paradox has fueled much of the fascination with the Green Man. Some scholars argue that the motif represents the adoption and Christianization of earlier pagan imagery. Before Christianity spread through Britain and Europe, Celtic and other indigenous religions held nature sacred. Trees were objects of veneration. Groves were sites of worship. Gods and spirits inhabited the natural world. When Christianity arrived, it often incorporated existing symbols and sacred sites, transforming them rather than destroying them. Pagan shrines became Christian churches. Pagan festivals were reinterpreted as Christian holy days. Perhaps the Green Man represents a similar process, a pre-Christian nature deity or symbol, allowed to persist in a new context. Others suggest the Green Man had different meanings within the Christian framework. He might represent resurrection, life emerging from death, the same promise offered by Christ's rising from the tomb. He might symbolize the Garden of Eden, humanity in harmony with creation before the fall. He could represent the saints who withdrew to the wilderness, hermits and monks who found God in nature far from civilization's corruption. Or perhaps more darkly, he represents the sin of lust, the green thoughts of desire, with the vegetation spewing from his mouth symbolizing uncontrolled earthly passions that must be overcome. The classical world knew similar imagery. The Romans had images of woodland deities, of Bacchus or Dionysus crowned with grape leaves, of Silvanus the forest god, of the wild man of the woods. Green man-like faces appear in Roman architectural decoration. These classical precedents might have been known to medieval craftsmen and could have influenced the development of the motif. But the green man as we know it from medieval churches seems to have developed most fully in the 12th through 15th centuries, flourishing, particularly during the Gothic period, when naturalistic decoration became increasingly popular in church architecture. One factor in the green man's proliferation may be simply aesthetic. Medieval stonemasons had considerable freedom in decorative elements. While the overall design of a church would be specified, the details of individual carvings were often left to the craftsman. The green man is visually striking, fills space effectively, and demonstrates the carver's skill in rendering both human features and naturalistic foliage. A talented mason might include green man carvings simply because they were beautiful, challenging to execute, and traditionally appropriate, without necessarily intending deep symbolic meaning. Yet the very fact that the motif became traditional suggests it resonated with people. Something about the image spoke to medieval minds. Perhaps it was the reminder that however much stone churches might seem to represent human order imposed on the landscape, nature remained powerful, ineradicable. The green man, staring down from the ceiling or lurking in a corner, whispered that the wild was never far away, that the church was built from the earth and would return to it, that God's creation included the untamed forest as well as the cultivated garden. Regional variations exist. In England, oak leaves are common, that most English of trees, sacred to druids and symbol of strength. In France, vine leaves often appear, appropriate for wine country and with Eucharistic symbolism. The motif is less common in regions of Europe that were not heavily forested, suggesting a connection to woodland culture, where people lived surrounded by forests, where trees were both resource and threat, nursery and danger. The green man made sense. With the Reformation and the move toward plainer church interiors, green man carvings fell out of favor. The Puritans who destroyed so much medieval church art surely removed many green men, along with other decorations they deemed superstitious or popish. Yet enough survived for the motif to be rediscovered and celebrated in later eras. The Victorian period saw renewed interest in medieval church architecture. Antiquarians catalogued and studied old carvings. The arts and crafts movement embraced medieval design aesthetics. William Morris and his circle created wallpapers and textiles featuring foliate heads. The Gothic revival in architecture led to new churches being built in medieval styles, and modern stonemasons sometimes included green man carvings in tribute to medieval precedents. In the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onward, the green man experienced a remarkable revival. Environmental movements embraced him as a symbol of humanity's connection to nature. Neo-pagan religions adopted him as a representation of the masculine aspect of nature, divinity, a counterpart to the goddess. Artists working in various media created new green man images. And perhaps most visibly, English pub signs began featuring the green man, with hundreds of pubs throughout Britain bearing that name, their signs showing the familiar foliate face. This modern popularity has sometimes led to the green man being credited with greater antiquity than evidence supports. Claims are made that he represents an ancient pan-European forest god worshipped for millennia, that medieval carvings are direct continuations of prehistoric religion. While appealing, these claims generally overreach the evidence. The medieval green man carvings are real and numerous, but clear precedents from pre-Christian Britain or early medieval periods are scarce. The motif seems to have emerged most fully in the High Middle Ages, possibly drawing on classical precedents and folk traditions, but not representing an unbroken line to ancient paganism. Yet, in a broader sense, the green man does connect to something ancient and universal. Cultures worldwide have personified nature, imagined spirits in trees and streams, created images of vegetation deities. The specific medieval English foliate head carvings may not be thousands of years old, but they tap into patterns of thought that are. They express the human awareness that we are part of nature, not separate from it, that our lives depend on the green growing world, and that for all our civilization and technology, we remain organic beings who will return to the earth. Today, you can find the Green Man everywhere, not just in old churches, though that's still the best place to see medieval originals, but in gardens, where Green Man plaques and sculptures are popular decorations, in jewelry and tattoos, in literature and film, where the archetype has been adopted for various purposes. The image has transcended its medieval origins to become a flexible symbol that different people interpret according to their own beliefs and values. What the medieval carvers truly intended, we may never know with certainty. They left no written explanations. But they left the carvings themselves, faces in the leaves, human and natural combined, watching from the shadows of ancient churches. The Green Man endures because the image speaks to something fundamental, the connection between humanity and the natural world, the cycle of death and rebirth, the power of life to persist, to push through stone, to flourish even in unexpected places. He is the face of the forest, peering at us from the walls we built, reminding us that we are never as separate from nature as we might think, that the wild is always just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. The north of England has its own distinctive folklore, shaped by the region's particular history and landscape. And among northern legends, few are as famous or as thoroughly embedded in local culture as the tale of the Lambton Worm, a story that combines elements of dragon slaying, family curses, and moral lessons about the consequences of sin and broken promises. This is County Durham's great legend, and it remains powerful in the region today. The story begins, as many folk tales do, with youthful wickedness. The Lambtons were a real family, gentry who held estates along the River Wear in Durham. In the legend, set in the 14th century, the young heir John Lambton was a dissolute youth, more interested in pleasure than piety, more drawn to hunting and fishing than to his religious duties. On one particular Sunday, while good Christians were attending church services, John decided instead to go fishing in the River Wear. He cast his line into the water, expecting perhaps a salmon or trout for his table. What he pulled from the water was something else entirely. A small creature, eel-like in shape but hideously malformed, with a fearsome head and, according to some versions, 9 holes on each side of its mouth. It was black, slimy, repulsive. John, disgusted by this unnatural catch and perhaps unnerved by having hooked such a thing on the Sabbath when he should have been at worship, tore the creature from his hook and threw it down a nearby well. He thought no more about it and went on with his careless life. Time passed. John, whether through genuine religious feeling or a desire for adventure, or perhaps guilt over his misspent youth, eventually took up the cross and journeyed to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. He was gone for 7 years, fighting under the burning sun of Palestine, seeking perhaps to redeem himself through service to Christendom. While John was absent, the creature he had so carelessly discarded was growing, fed by whatever lived in the well, or perhaps by its own unnatural nature. It grew larger and larger, until finally it was too big for the well that had contained it. It emerged, and what crawled out was no longer a small eel-like thing but an enormous serpent, a worm in the old Northern English sense of the word, meaning dragon. The Lambton Worm had been born, and it immediately began to terrorize the countryside. The worm took up residence coiled around a nearby hill, ever after known as Worm Hill. From this vantage point, it surveyed the surrounding lands like a medieval dragon, claiming its territory. Its very presence seemed to blight the earth. Crops failed, livestock began disappearing. At first, farmers found their sheep and cattle vanished from fields. Then they began finding the remains, animals drained of milk and crushed by coils powerful enough to squeeze the life from a full-grown ox. The worm, legends said, could wrap itself 7 times around a cow, constricting it to death while simultaneously draining its milk before consuming the carcass. Terror spread through the region. People lived in fear. The local villagers, hoping to appease the monster, began leaving a trough of milk for it each day. The worm would drink this offering and, temporarily sated, leave them alone. But this was barely a solution. The tribute was a constant drain on resources, and sometimes the worm's hunger exceeded what the milk could satisfy, and it would hunt despite the offerings. Warriors came to try to kill the beast. Knights in armor, strong men with sharp swords, local heroes seeking to end the terror. They hacked and slashed at the worm, and their blades did bite into its flesh, cutting deeply. But the worm possessed a terrifying power. When it was cut in two, the severed pieces would writhe toward each other and rejoin. The creature would make itself whole again, its wounds healing as though they had never been. No matter how many times it was cut, how many pieces it was hacked into, the Lambton Worm could not be killed by conventional means. One by one, the would-be dragon slayers retreated in defeat or were themselves killed by the monster. Finally, after 7 long years, Sir John Lambton returned from the Crusades. He was no longer the careless youth who had gone fishing on a Sunday morning. He was now a hardened knight, experienced in war, his soul hopefully cleansed by his service in the Holy Land. But when he returned to his estates, he found not prosperity but desolation. His lands were blighted, his people lived in fear, and he learned the terrible truth. The monster terrorizing his home was the creature he himself had caught and thoughtlessly cast away years before. His sin, his casual wickedness, had literally come back to haunt his homeland. Sir John was filled with remorse and determination. He swore he would kill the worm he had inadvertently created or die in the attempt. But how to fight a creature that could not be killed by sword alone? John sought advice from a wise woman who lived nearby, someone versed in old knowledge, perhaps a witch or cunning woman, the kind of local healer and seer that existed on the margins of medieval Christian society. The wise woman listened to his tale. She told him the secret to defeating the worm. He must have a suit of armor made, covered with sharp spearheads and razor blades, protruding from every surface. He must fight the worm in the river Wear itself, where the current ran swift and strong. When the worm coiled around him to crush him, its own constricting action would drive the blades into its body. And as John cut it with his sword, he must ensure that each severed piece was immediately swept away by the river current before it could rejoin the rest. The water would carry the pieces downstream and apart, preventing the worm from healing itself. But the wise woman also gave a warning, and it was here that the tale took on its darkest dimension. "Before you go to fight the worm," she said, "you must make a vow. When you have killed the beast, you must then slay the first living creature you see thereafter. If you keep this vow, all will be well. But if you break it, a curse will fall upon your house. For 9 generations, no Lord of Lambton shall die peacefully in his bed." It was a terrible condition. To save his people, John must agree to murder an innocent creature, possibly even a person, after his victory. But seeing no alternative, desperate to end the plague he had brought upon his lands, John agreed. He commissioned the spiked armor, had it forged by the best smiths. Before departing to face the worm, he arranged a signal with his father and household. When he blew his hunting horn 3 times, they were to release his favorite hunting hound, his most loyal dog. John would fulfill the vow by slaying the dog, a difficult but manageable sacrifice. Clad in his terrible spiked armor, John Lambton waded into the river Wear and called out a challenge to the worm. The monster, hearing a human voice crying defiance, surged down from its hill and plunged into the water to destroy this latest challenger. The great serpent wrapped its massive coils around the armored knight, attempting to crush him as it had crushed so many others. But this time, the worm's own strength worked against it. The spearheads and blades covering John's armor pierced deep into the creature's body. The more tightly it squeezed, the more grievously it wounded itself. John, meanwhile, hacked with his sword, cutting through the worm's flesh. Each severed chunk of the beast was immediately caught by the swift current and swept downstream, carried away before it could wriggle back to rejoin the hole. The river ran dark with the monster's blood. The battle was long and desperate, knight and worm locked in mortal combat in the middle of the flowing water. But gradually, piece by piece, the Lambton Worm was destroyed. Finally, the last segment of the creature was cut away and carried off by the current. The worm was dead. The terror was ended. Exhausted, wounded, but victorious, John Lambton dragged himself from the river and blew his horn 3 times, the prearranged signal. But in the confusion and joy of the moment, his father forgot the instructions. Hearing the horn and knowing his son was victorious, the old lord rushed from the castle himself, desperate to embrace his heroic son, to welcome him home, to celebrate the deliverance of their lands. John saw his father running toward him and froze in horror. The first living creature he had seen after killing the worm was his own father. To keep the vow, he would have to murder the old man. He could not do it, would not do it. Patricide was unthinkable, even to fulfill a vow made to a witch. Moments later, the hunting hound came running out, and John, sickened but seeing no other option, slew the dog, but it was too late. The first creature he had seen was his father. The vow was broken, and so the curse fell upon the house of Lambton. The lands were freed from the worm, but the family paid a terrible price. For 9 generations, the legend insists, the lords of Lambton died violently or suddenly. Not one died peacefully in his bed of old age. Some were killed in battle, others in accidents, others by sudden illness. The curse worked its way through the family line, generation after generation, a legacy of that broken vow, that single moment of compassion for a father that undid the victory over the worm. How much of this tale is true? The Lambton family was real, and they held estates in County Durham. The various geographical features, the River Wear, Worm Hill, the village of Lambton, all exist. But no medieval records document the actual events described in the legend. The story was first written down in the 19th century, based on earlier ballads and oral tradition. Like many folk tales, it likely contains kernels of historical truth wrapped in layers of elaboration and fantasy. The themes of the Lambton Worm are clear. It is a story about sin and its consequences. John's casual disregard for God's law, fishing on the Sabbath, directly led to the creation of the monster. His personal sin brought suffering to his entire community. The tale thus served as a moral lesson in a deeply religious society. Keep holy the Sabbath. Do not mock God's laws. Your sins may seem harmless at the time, but their consequences can grow beyond all imagining. The story also deals with the difficulty of redemption. John tried to redeem himself through the Crusades, but his past followed him home. He had to face and destroy what he had created, a common pattern in hero tales. And even in victory, there was tragedy. The curse that followed the broken vow suggests that some actions have consequences that cannot fully be undone, that even well-intentioned violations of vows carry weight. The Lambton Worm has remained central to County Durham's cultural identity. The tale has been retold countless times in ballads, stories, plays, and modern retellings. The worm appears in local art and on signs. Tourist sites reference the legend, and every person from the region knows the story, taught from childhood. A piece of shared heritage that binds the community to its landscape and its past. In recent decades, the legend has been reinterpreted through various lenses. Environmental readings see the worm as nature's revenge for human carelessness, the thrown-away creature growing into an ecological disaster. Psychological interpretations view it as externalized guilt, John's disregarded conscience returning as a monster he must face. Feminist scholars have examined the role of the wise woman, whose knowledge is essential but who is ultimately blamed when the male hero fails to keep his vow. Whatever one's interpretation, the Lambton Worm remains a powerful story, a northern dragon tale that can stand alongside any from literature or mythology. It is England's answer to Beowulf's dragon or Sigurd's Fafnir. And unlike more famous legends that have been claimed by the nation as a whole, the Lambton Worm belongs specifically to Durham, to the north, to the people of that region who kept the tale alive through the centuries. The worm may be dead, slain in the River Wear long ago, but the legend lives on, coiled around the cultural heart of County Durham, as persistent as the curse that followed the breaking of a vow. England's landscape is thick with legends. Every region, every county, sometimes every village has its own particular stories, its own ghosts and heroes and wonders. While we have explored some of the most famous tales in depth, many others deserve at least brief mention, for they too form part of the rich folklore that makes England such a story-haunted land. In the royal forests of Berkshire, there rides the ghost of Herne the Hunter. The legend tells of a huntsman in the service of King Richard II, a man named Herne who was the finest hunter in England. During a royal hunt, the king was attacked by a wounded stag. Herne threw himself between the beast and his monarch, saving the king's life but receiving a mortal wound in the process. A mysterious figure appeared, some say a wizard, others say the devil himself, who offered to save Herne's life in exchange for his soul or his woodland skills. Herne agreed and was healed, but with the stag's antlers now attached to his head, his fellow huntsmen, jealous of his skill and disturbed by his appearance, plotted against him. In despair, Herne hanged himself from an oak tree in Windsor Great Park, but death brought no peace. Herne's ghost began to appear, riding through the forest at night on a spectral horse, accompanied by phantom hounds, a wild hunt crashing through the trees. The antlers remained affixed to his head, marking him forever. Chains rattled as he passed. His appearance was said to portend disaster for the nation or the royal family. The oak from which he hanged himself became known as Herne's Oak, and though the original tree is long gone, others have inherited the name. Shakespeare immortalized Herne the Hunter in The Merry Wives of Windsor, ensuring that the legend spread far beyond Berkshire. The image of the antlered ghost leading the wild hunt has become iconic in English folklore, an example of how stories can merge with older pan-European motifs. The wild hunt appears throughout European folklore, a ghostly procession of riders and hounds that sweeps across the land, particularly during storms. Herne's hunt represents the English version of this widespread legend, localized to Windsor Forest and connected to specific English history. The story of Lady Godiva presents a very different kind of legend, one tied to the medieval town of Coventry. According to the tale, Godiva was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, in the 11th century. Leofric had imposed heavy taxes on the people of Coventry, and Godiva, moved by their suffering, pleaded with him repeatedly to lift the burden. Finally, exasperated by her requests, Leofric made what he thought was an impossible challenge. He would remove the taxes if she would ride naked through the marketplace at noon. To his astonishment, Godiva agreed. She sent word through the town that all citizens should stay indoors with their shutters closed during her ride. On the appointed day, Lady Godiva rode through Coventry, her only covering her long hair, enduring humiliation for the sake of her people. The citizens honored her sacrifice by remaining indoors, keeping their eyes averted. Only one man, a tailor named Tom, bored a hole in his shutter to peek at her. According to legend, he was instantly struck blind, and thus was born the phrase, Peeping Tom. Leofric, true to his word, lifted the taxes. The story celebrates female courage, compassion, and self-sacrifice. A noblewoman willing to endure shame to help the common people. Modern historians suggest there is likely a historical kernel to the tale. Godiva was a real person, a wealthy landowner who made significant donations to religious institutions. The famous ride may have been a later elaboration, but it became the defining element of her legacy. Coventry celebrates Lady Godiva as a civic heroine, and processions commemorating her ride have been held for centuries. Spring-Heeled Jack represents a very different type of legend, one born in the Victorian era rather than medieval times. Beginning in 1837, reports emerged from London of a mysterious figure attacking people, particularly women, on dark streets. Witnesses described him as tall and thin, wearing a cloak and sometimes tight-fitting white garments. His most remarkable feature was his ability to leap incredible distances and heights, bounding over walls and onto rooftops with ease that defied normal human capability. The attacks were bizarre and terrifying. Jack would leap out of the darkness, often breathing blue flames into his victims' faces, tearing at their clothing with clawed hands, and then escape by leaping away before anyone could apprehend him. He seemed to target lone women, but also frightened watchmen and other witnesses. The press sensationalized the accounts, and panic spread through London and eventually other parts of England. Who or what was Spring-Heeled Jack? Theories ranged widely. Some believed he was a demon or devil. Others thought he might be an aristocrat playing cruel pranks, using theatrical effects and mechanical springs in his boots to achieve his remarkable leaps. Some suggested mass hysteria, that initial incidents sparked copycat attacks and misidentifications. No culprit was ever definitively identified, and sightings continued sporadically into the early 20th century before finally ceasing. Spring-Heeled Jack represents a uniquely Victorian legend, a creature of the industrial city rather than the rural countryside. He embodies urban fears, the danger lurking in dark alleys and fog-bound streets, the anonymity and vulnerability of city life, perhaps even anxieties about technology and what new inventions might make possible. Where older folklore gave rural England its ghosts and monsters, Spring-Heeled Jack was London's own particular terror, a legend born from gaslit streets and sensational journalism. The West Country has its own rich tradition of folklore. Cornwall in particular, that wind-swept peninsula where Celtic traditions remained strong long after they faded elsewhere in England, is thick with legends. Giants feature prominently in Cornish tales. Jack, the Giant Killer, the clever farm boy who outwitted and killed numerous giants, supposedly performed his most famous deeds in Cornwall. The Giant of Street, Michael's Mount, Cormoran, was his first victim. These giant stories may preserve folk memories of ancient monuments like standing stones, explained by people who had forgotten their true origins as the work of giant builders from a previous age. Cornwall also has its traditions of piskies, the Cornish version of fairies or pixies, small supernatural beings who could be helpful or mischievous depending on their mood and how they were treated. Piskies might lead travelers astray, making them pixie-led, wandering in circles on familiar paths, or they might help with household chores if properly respected. Like fairy beliefs throughout Britain, piskie traditions represented a way of explaining fortune and misfortune, the unexplained noises in the night, the mysterious disappearance of objects, the sudden confusion that could strike even in familiar places. The North Country has Hull's own ghostly traditions. Beside the Lambton Worm, there are tales of bargists, spectral black dogs similar to Black Shuck, and stories of witches and wise women whose powers were both feared and sought after. Lancashire, in particular, was notorious for witch trials in the 17th century. The Pendle witches, 12 people accused of witchcraft and tried in 1612, became one of the most famous witch trial cases in English history. The story of these supposed witches, whether they were genuine practitioners of folk magic or innocent victims of hysteria and accusation, has become embedded in Lancashire folklore. Each region of England has its own particular character and folklore, shaped by landscape, history, and culture. The flat wetlands of the fens in eastern England have stories of will-o'-the-wisps and marsh lights, mysterious glows that lead travelers to their deaths in the bogs. The moors of Yorkshire and Derbyshire have tales of travelers lost in sudden fogs, of mysterious lights on the hilltops, of ancient barrows that should not be disturbed. The Welsh borders have their own mix of English and Welsh traditions, with tales that blend Celtic and Anglo-Saxon elements. London itself, as the nation's capital and largest city, has accumulated countless legends over its long history. The Tower of London is reputedly one of the most haunted buildings in Britain, with ghosts, including Anne Boleyn and the young princes supposedly murdered by Richard III. London Bridge, before its modern reconstructions, was said to be built on foundations that included human sacrifices. Dick Whittington, the poor boy who became Lord Mayor, though based on a real historical figure who served as Lord Mayor of London multiple times in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, accumulated folkloric elements in the retelling, including his magical cat and the bells of London calling him back to greatness when he was ready to give up, details not found in historical records. The streets of London echo with centuries of stories, ghost tales and murder legends, tales of plague and fire, of monarchs and commoners, all woven into the city's fabric. What these diverse regional legends share is their connection to place. They are not abstract stories that could happen anywhere. They belong to specific locations, specific landscapes, specific communities. This geographic rootedness is one of the most distinctive features of English folklore. The stories help create a sense of identity, binding people to their region and to their ancestors who told the same tales. When a child growing up in Durham hears the story of the Lambton Worm, they are being initiated into their local culture, learning what makes their region special and different from others. The persistence of these regional legends, even in our modern globalized age, suggests they fulfill important psychological and social functions. They provide continuity with the past, a sense that we are part of a long story that extends before us and will continue after us. They make the landscape meaningful, transforming ordinary hills and rivers into places with stories, with significance beyond mere geography. They offer moral lessons, entertainment, and a sense of the mysterious and wonderful lurking just beneath everyday reality. In recent decades, local tourism boards and heritage organizations have increasingly recognized the value of folklore. Historical sites market themselves using associated legends. Walking tours follow routes connected to ghost stories and folk tales. Festivals celebrate regional traditions. This commercialization of folklore is sometimes criticized as inauthentic, as packaging tradition for tourist consumption. But it also represents a form of keeping these stories alive, ensuring new generations encounter them and that the legends remain part of living culture rather than becoming merely academic subjects studied by folklorists. The relationship between folklore and truth remains complex and ambiguous. Some legends clearly preserve historical events, however distorted by retelling. Others seem to be pure fiction, creative stories with no factual basis. Most fall somewhere in between, perhaps beginning with a real incident or person but accumulating fictional elements over time until fact and fantasy are inextricably intertwined. But this ambiguity is part of folklore's power. The stories occupy a liminal space, not quite history but not quite pure fiction either, and in that uncertain territory they can speak truths that neither pure fact nor obvious fiction could convey. The English landscape remains haunted by its legends. Walk through any old forest and you might recall Robin Hood or Herne. Visit a medieval church and search for the Green Man watching from the shadows. Stand on a lonely East Anglian road at dusk and remember Black Shuck. Travel to Durham and look for Worm Hill. These stories have shaped how English people see their land, adding layers of meaning and mystery to the physical geography. And as long as people continue to tell these tales, to visit these sites, to feel that shiver of recognition when encountering a place they know from legend, the folklore remains alive, continues to evolve, and keeps England story-haunted.